Hi guys, David here from Almost Daily Science. So today I want to talk about a recent paper that was very intriguing that came out in the field of human pheromone science. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the claims of the paper, and then we're actually going to dive in and see if we think the claims that the paper makes are actually justified by the data. So to start off with, I did originally find out about this paper from this journalistic summary. This is the article is called "Babies' Superpowered Scent Can Manipulate Parents' Moods, Researchers Find," which is very intriguing. I've seen a number of articles in the past about the scent that babies give off and how this can have different psychological effects on men and women. I'm not going to really examine those papers today. We're just going to look at this one, but we'll start off with just a really brief summary of some of the highlights. So this article says, a chemical that babies give off from their heads calms men but makes women more aggressive, according to new research in the journal Science Advances. It could be a chemical defense system we inherited from our animal ancestors, the authors speculate, making women more likely to defend their babies and men less likely to kill them. The article goes on to say that basically this is not a really novel concept because chemical odors have been noted to induce different behavioral phenotypes in different species. So for instance, a rabbit mom will attack her pups if they smell like another female rabbit, or mice whose sense of smell is damaged don't attack other mice intruding on their territory. In this latest study, scientists tested how people responded to a chemical called hexadecanal, or hex. Hex is found in body odor and breath. It's also found in feces, and raising babies is, quote, the one social setting where humans have extensive exposure to feces. They also discovered that hex is the most abundant of the many chemicals babies' heads give off. So looking at the actual paper, the paper is called "Sniffing the Human Body, Volatile, Hexadecanal, Blocks Aggression in Men but Triggers Aggression in Women." So looking at the actual chemical structure, it's pretty simple. It's just basically got a long hydrocarbon chain with a double bond to an oxygen at the end, for those of you who are curious about the structure. And looking at the abstract of the paper, it says that in terrestrial mammals, body volatiles can effectively trigger or block aggression. Here we tested whether hexadecanal, a human body volatile implicated as a mammalian-wide social chemosignal, affects human aggression. So their broad approach in this paper is to take a pretty large sample set of humans and divide them into groups based on their gender and based on whether they were in a control group or the actual study. And what they did is they did behavioral tests, and they also did some brain scanning to see if groups that were exposed to hexadecanol behaved or had different brain patterns than groups that were not exposed to hexadecanol. So one of the things that I think we're going to find by looking at the figures, the actual data in this paper, is that sometimes the claims that are made about research, especially the claims that are made in sort of a journalistic summary like we were looking at first, often overstate the significance of a given effect. And so we'll see this pretty soon. So what they did here is they had a game, they had a series of games that the subject participants played. And you see here that there's groups of women and groups of men, and both groups are exposed in some cases to a control, which they had to smell something that did not contain hexadecanol, and then the other ones smelled something that did contain hexadecanol. And basically, they had also done tests that there was not really a significant difference in the perception of how these mixtures smelled to people, especially in terms of pleasantness. So it's not like the hexadecanol was like a nice smell and the one without hexadecanol was like a bad smell. They had rated the pleasantness of the odors as being pretty much equivalent. So we're not just looking at some kind of like rejection bias, like, oh, that smells bad, that's going to then affect my behavior. It's more like whatever is going on is presumably subliminal in nature. And so basically you have men and women, and they're both exposed, or they're split into groups where one is exposed to hexadecanol and one is not. And then what they did is they played a game, a computer game, where there was a provocation of some sort. So basically they were playing a game versus they thought they were playing against a person, but it wasn't really a person, it was just a computer algorithm. And in the game, the computer algorithm, like what they're thinking is another person, actually cheats several times during the game, which that's the provocation, right? So basically they're doing something which makes the participant feel like they're being wronged in some way. And then what they do is they play another game where if they win, they get to punish the other player. Again, the other player is not real, but the participant thinks the other player is real. And they get to punish them by like pressing a button which will give a loud noise. And so presumably if they are more aggressive, then they will they'll give them like a loud noise blast, and that will be the punishment. And then what they do is, there's sort of a ratio between the level of provocation and how aggressively they respond, and that might be sort of an indication of how aggressive the person is feeling. So the idea is that if you are exposed to hexadecanal, maybe that's going to make you more or less aggressive, and then your behavior during the game, you'll sort of be more aggressive. And I actually thought this was a pretty clever way to actually try to quantify something like aggressiveness, because aggressiveness is such a subjective concept, really. It's like how do you really quantify that? Well, I thought this was pretty clever. So getting into the actual data results from this trial, what we have here is we have up top we have the results for men, and at the bottom we have the results for women. On the left is the control group, so this was just exposed to some scent that didn't contain hexadecanol. And then the hexadecanal group was exposed to a scent that had the same stuff but also had hexadecanol. And what you can see here is, so a noise blast level of 1 is like not bad, and a noise blast level of 6 is highly aggressive. That's like the loudest noise that they can give. So if they were really aggressive, they would be hitting 6s and 5s a lot of the time. And what's interesting is that there does seem to be a difference in the control group for men, for instance. You have, a fair amount of 1s, like yellows, so people were just pressing the 1, like they didn't really want to punish anybody, they weren't feeling aggressive. And then in hexadecanal, there's even more of the 1s. So it looks like for the hexadecanal group, there's a little bit, people are shifting towards less aggressive behavior. Conversely, for women, it's the opposite. So for women, for instance, the control group that wasn't exposed to hexadecanol was pretty lenient overall. And then they actually got more aggressive. You can see this because there's less yellow, there's less 1s, and higher ratings, louder noise blasts are more predominant in the hexadecanal group. So there definitely does seem to be some difference in these two groups, but so far I have to say that it doesn't seem like a very strong signal. Because first of all, there's quite a bit of scatter, so you have instances where, for instance, for some of the trials, actually, if you compare certain of the trials for the hexadecanal group, they actually look a little bit more aggressive than some from the control group, even though overall, maybe the hexadecanal group for men is more lenient, but it's not super convincing. So we'll have to dig a little bit deeper into the data to see if we can actually get convinced by this. So as I said before, it was kind of hard to visualize what was going on in the prior study. So what they did is they actually, for each trial, they averaged the noise blast intensity. And then they put that intensity, so this is for women, they have a line graph of the different trials. And they have the average blast intensity for women on hexadecanol and women who were not on hexadecanol. And you can see actually that those lines are very, very close together. And a lot of the times you can see from the shadowed line that actually the like one standard deviation of the two actually overlap, which I'm not a statistician, but in my thinking when I'm doing statistical analysis of my own data that I get in my own lab, I generally think that when you have significant overlap of the standard deviation of one standard deviation from your mean, then that is a strong indication that there's not much difference between your control and your experimental group. So actually, when you see this put together, it does kind of make you think like there's not really a strong signal here. A little bit stronger for the men. So for instance, we're seeing that the men control group overall is looking to be more intense than that of the hexadecanol group. So there's definitely less overlap in the standard deviations of the two groups, but still not super convincing overall. But maybe they have more convincing data going forward further. So figure 5 summarizes the result of another game that they did. So in this one, in a within subjects design, participants were exposed to an odorant, hex, and control, while they played a game where their online partners stole their money occasionally. That's the provocation. During the game, they could aggress against that same person by deducting money from them. That's the aggression. And then what they're looking at is they sort of quantify this, and then they have the level of provocation, and then they have the level of aggression, and then they have an APR, so that's the aggression to provocation ratio. So the idea is that if you have a given subject show a lot of aggression for maybe a small amount of provocation, that would be an indication that overall they're in a more aggressive state, perhaps induced by this chemical exposure. So what's interesting is their conclusion from this study is that in these 2 consecutive experiments, and this one with the APR being the second one, their conclusion is that hex decreased aggression in men, but increased aggression in women. However, when I'm looking at this data, especially this inset here, which shows the APR for men and women, comparing the control groups and the hexadecanal groups, I don't see much difference in this. So for instance, we have the control group here, which is showing different levels of APRs. And by the way, that's quite a scatter. That looks, there's a little bit of a cluster down near 0 or 1. But generally speaking, when I see data like this, it looks random to me. And that makes sense because it's the control group. And then we have hexadecanal that it's a little bit tighter, but it still looks pretty random to me. Like the standard deviation is very, very large. And then for women, they have a similar, I guess taking out a couple of outliers, they're saying that they have a little bit of a tighter distribution when it comes to women. So just in general, it looks like to start off with, maybe women are a little bit less aggressive than men. That might be one conclusion. And then the hexadecanal group, they have a larger variation. However, if you look at the means of the two, the means for the control group and the hexadecanal group for men are basically the same as they are for women. So I'm not really sure where they're getting from this that this is confirming that there's a difference between the control group and the hexadecanal groups. If anything, when I'm looking at this, I see probably no real difference between the control group and the hexadecanal group. Obviously, I'm not saying that I understand this information more than the authors, but just from a point of view of, I think that scientists should have a very high filter, like a strong BS detector. Is this just, I don't feel convinced by this data. I'm not seeing the same conclusion that the authors drew, and that could be a problem. In the last part of the study, they do brain scans, and they're trying to basically find if there's a difference between the groups exposed to hexadecanal or in the groups exposed to the controls under different provocation parameters. So basically, if you do things to provoke someone and they've been exposed to hexadecanal and you measure their brain scan and you do the same thing with someone who is not exposed to hexadecanal, then by looking at the brain scan differences, you should be able to see if there's some kind of common theme that emerges in terms of what parts of the brain light up. This is far enough outside of my skill set that I don't feel comfortable trying to break it down or debunk it or even to support it. But I will say that there were some things in it that kind of make me doubt. So they say, we reiterate that these statistics are merely to verify directionality, as the statistic associated with this finding remains the mapping statistic alone, namely p is less than 0.01, corrected for multiple comparisons. In other words, what they're saying is, well, we put together some statistics, but we don't really know whether they're statistically significant. That was my conclusion. Maybe that's the wrong conclusion. And if you're more knowledgeable about brain scan statistics, please correct me in the comment section. I would love to know if I'm wrong about this. To be fair to the authors, they actually in the discussion go to great lengths to talk about the limitations of the study. So I do kind of disagree with their conclusions, which is to say that I'm not saying that they're definitely wrong. I'm just saying that the data that they provide did not convince me. But they do say, despite the above limitations, which they listed, there's a number, we conclude in stating that sniffing the body odor constituent hex blocks aggression in men but triggers aggression in women. Hex may exert its effects by modulating functional connectivity between the brain substrates of the social appraisal and the brain substrates of aggressive execution. And so they're saying that we think this might be the mechanism in terms of the brain on why we observe this different aggression behavior. So if anything, what this does is I think that this is another reminder that you need to be careful about taking science journalism at face value, because I think that the claims that were made in the journalistic summary of this paper were pretty strong. Like, wow, this is the way things work. Now we understand how humans interact and how the scent of babies modulates behavior in adult males and adult females, and that's giving us this great insight. But when you actually look at the data, it's kind of like, I mean, I don't think it's particularly convincing. I admit that this is not my field, but I do think that everybody should be able to, hopefully, if you're a scientist or a science enthusiast, you should feel comfortable sort of reading what you can and then just asking yourself, do the conclusions of this study truly find support in the data that are provided? That's kind of that's what doing science is actually about, is kind of arguing about whether the given data supports the claims that are made. And anybody can do that. One of the things that I liked about the summary article is that they got a quote from a neuroscientist who is not involved in the research. And this person said, "In the beginning, I found it a little bit far-fetched," said neuroscientist Jessica Freiherr at Friedrich Alexander University, who is not involved with the research. But, quote, "it makes sense," she said in an interview. So, I mean, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement. That's not like, well, I dug into the data and I really think this is true. I've really analyzed it and they've convinced me. It's more like, yeah, it makes sense, I guess. That was that was the vibe that I got. I guess in conclusion, it would be really nice to believe this, and it might be true. It might be true that babies' superpowered scent can manipulate parents' moods. But I think it's a little premature to say that that's definitely true. There's definitely some strong, evolutionary reasoning behind it. Like we said before, chemical that babies give off their heads. If it calms men, then maybe it makes men less likely to kill babies. And that's not a super common behavior among humans, but